Hello, everybody. Welcome. It's 6 o'clock and we're about to start the conversation originally planned as a book talk. And as you can see on your screens, we're celebrating tonight the new book that is a revised and expanded version of the classic late 20th century, 1999 edition of New York and Illustrated History. And this evening was conceived of first as a presentation and a conversation by James Sanders, who with his partner of almost 30 years now, I guess actually more than 30 years, because when they met back in the in undergraduate days at Columbia University, and then they began to work together from about 1991 on various projects. James and Ric have been an incredible duo of New York City history, working separately and then together on a number of projects, and most famously, of course, the one that we're celebrating the next chapter of tonight, which is New York, a documentary, the film series that they created for PBS and eventually 8-part series that will be added to next year in additional episodes, which will bring, like the book, New York's history up to the present moment. I'm sure that everyone in the audience, almost everyone, if they didn't see the New York documentary film when it was occupying our screens, preoccupying our minds back in 1999. You've seen it in one or another versions of their replay on public television or on the magnetic tapes or the DVDs. This presentation of the history of New York, this kind of compendium of the city, a narrative of the city that Ric and James crafted together, has really been a kind of leitmotif for understanding New York City history. And because this is not a visual presentation tonight, so much as a conversation, what I'm going to do now is to show some of the images from these last 2 chapters of the expanded book, just cycling through them as I introduce Ric and James. So you'll see them on a loop, and they may repeat or may not, but they will give you a flavor of some of the themes of the more contemporary history and narrative of New York that you'll find in this expanded version. So Ric Burns is a documentary filmmaker, I'm sure you all know, who since the 1990, when he produced with his older brother Ken the Civil War series for PBS, has been investigating all lines of American history, but he's known, of course, for the New York series. And Ric is the filmmaker, but he has been a partner with James Sanders, who produced the original documentary series with him, who wrote the companion volume, and who is the co-author of the volume that has just been published. Let me mention to you that on our website, you'll see the underlined link of the title of the book, and you'll be able to click on there and purchase a copy, because the book, and I forgot to bring my copy downstairs with me, is a big, fat, more than 800-page volume, hard to carry around. So if you want to use one of those services for book delivery, you'll find a discounted rate for the book as well. So we're plugging the book tonight, and we'll do that at the end as well. It's a beautiful volume. It is so visually splendid, but it's not so much the pictures that you're getting a sampling of here that we're talking about. It's the history, it's the narrative, it's the framing of the issues of trying to understand the themes and the history of New York. So Ric's experience, as I said, goes back to the 1990s. James began to collaborate with him in the 90s as they conceived the idea, and they're going to tell you about this themselves, for the series, the multi-part series, ultimately 17 and a half hours of New York, a documentary film. Ric then founded Steeplechase Films in 1889 after working on the Civil War and other projects, and he's produced other films for public television and especially for WGBH in Boston. He has worked with James on a number of projects, but has many individual series to his own credit. James Sanders is an architect. He practices at his eponymous James Sanders Studio, where he does a whole range of projects devoted to design and also research. He's also the author of Celluloid Skyline, about the history of film and New York in the history of film. And I found a quote that I wanted to mention by a reviewer, I think it was from the Los Angeles Times or something, on James' book, which was published in 2001, who said that James makes the argument that New York remains the single greatest locus of American dreaming in the American movies. So it's New York that is the locus of that. And the reviewer asserted that Sanders is the Freud of that dream. So cinema, documentaries, images, New York, history, these are all the things that we're going to talk about tonight. So let me invite James and Ric to come on the screen. We'll stop sharing the images now of the sequence, and the three of us will converse about their own history as a couple of producers of documentaries. And then we'll go on to questions and conversation. So James, can I ask you to start to talk about your partnership in these projects for this nearly 30 years?
Sure, thank you, Carol, and thank you so much for having us here. I know Ric and I are both thrilled to be part of it and thrilled to be talking to you. And if some people don't know, we should remind people that you yourself were a participant in our 8th episode of the New York series many years ago, talking brilliantly about the World Trade Center. I think Ric and I met I'm not sure, in the 1970s sometimes. We were both at Columbia College. I think
James, I think you need to turn your volume up just a little bit.
Okay, I can do that.
Or talk a little bit louder.
Is that better? Can you hear me now better? Okay,
yeah,
or I can lose.
Talking, I think.
Okay, is that better? Or come closer? Is that good? I'm using AirPods, so okay. Is that all right? Can you hear?
It sounds about the same, but keep the volume.
Okay, all right. We had met in college, and then never lost touch, but we sort of went our separate ways. And then always sort of chatted a little bit about this and that. At one point, the New York Times asked me to review. I watched from afar as Ric, and he'll tell you his story, but moved on from his literary career to working in film with his brother. And I watched in kind of amazement and enormously impressed. And the day came when the New York Times actually asked me to review a new film that this man called Ric Burns had made. And I quickly told the New York Times that I knew Ric Burns, and was that a problem? They said no one would ever publish a review in the New York Times if that were a problem. And I reviewed this marvelous, wonderful, haunting, magical film about Coney Island that more than told its story. It brought it back to life. It evoked it. You were there. You felt it. And that was a good excuse, it seemed to be, to reconnect with Ric. And we began our friendship and reignited our friendship and reconnected. And so our well-worn story goes, we were at the Algonquin Hotel one night, and we were talking about different ideas. And I think it was Ric who said, why don't we just do, I think I was thinking about Celluloid Skyline, Ric was thinking about Robert Moses, and somehow in the course of the conversation, I think Ric said, why don't we just do all of New York? And kind of took my breath away, at least. We'd had one or two drinks, but at that point we did sit down and get serious about it and begin to write the treatments and begin to get the funding. And by now Ric had the reputation that allowed us to proceed. And I was new to everything, but excited about it. and had had a long time interest in the city, and we were off and running.
Do you remember it the same way, Rick?
I do. I think that was, I was actually promoting our Coney Island film at the Sundance Film Festival, and got a call from James up in the mountains, he in New York. And it just seemed like one of those kismet moments of reconnection of somebody who I hadn't really lost touch with. And I think that that's very much the way it happened. And I think that what was really striking, about the beginning of the project was a kind of, we were determined, if we were going to tell this whole story of New York, that it wasn't going to be an encyclopedia. I mean, there are wonderful encyclopedias, and Ken Jackson's incredible Encyclopedia of New York City was a borning then. And in fact, he lent us sort of galley copies as we were working on our film before it was published. But we were determined to make a narrative out of it, because it's film. Because film, starts and begins and ends, and is not, you have to be clear about where you're going the whole time. And we spent years, a couple, 2-3 years, after deciding to do this project in the early mid-90s, determining what would a film about New York be? I mean, what would that story be? And that story that we arrived at, with a lot of blood, sweat, and tears. As you can see, I come to you from the Witness Protection Program and Why I'm So Dark, but it was a lot of blood, sweat, and tears. At the heart of it was a sense that New York had a very unusual and distinctive North American story, that it was the first place to be founded completely as a commercial enterprise. And so one recognizes in its beginnings what it remains, this remarkable, intense, sometimes even predatory commercial enterprise. And that it was clear from the start as well that, if you don't have an ideological set of principles guiding who can come, like you're not Puritan Boston, you're not Quaker Philadelphia, and, you're just like a business opportunity, begun by the Dutch West India Company, that you don't have any sort of filter for keeping people out. And that was a unique aspect of this colony, going back to the earliest days of the Dutch. Peter Stuyvesant, Calvinist ex-soldier, was determined to keep Jews out when they fled the Brazilian version of the Spanish Inquisition in the 1650s. And the board, chastised it and said, Peter, we're a business. We're not a religion here. This is not a church you're running. And if word gets out that everyone's not welcome here, our already severe labor shortage will get worse. And so commercial dedication and diversity turned out to be, with nobody intending it, hand in glove from the beginning. The fewer rules you have for inclusion, the more people come. And that's why New York, New Amsterdam was already a very, very mixed, miscegenated, multiple place, going back to the 1630s, 1640s, with 19 languages by 1643. That's our story. How a tremendous concentration of commerce and diversity, or as we now call it, capitalism and democracy, took shape in New York. And those two things together created this continually, rapidly self-transforming culture. New peoples are continually coming in because there's nothing to stop them. New ideas are there because you have like a commercial engine that wants new products and new ways of making things. And so this emphasis on new in what rapidly became New York was not incidental by any means, that it was going to be continually transforming itself. That's the story that we set out to tell in our initially 14-hour film, and then our 17.5-hour film, and which we're continuing to tell in 2 new episodes. What's the fate of this increasingly globalized, intensely commercial, extremely diverse, self-transforming society, which has this kind of amazing aspirational quality to it? You want more, you want to reinvent yourself, you want to become here and change who you are. And that's been the character of New York, not exclusively, but in a particularly intense way for more than 400 years. And surprise, surprise, in the 21st century with these new chapters and new episodes. It's continuing with surprises and challenges.
Well, James, we had a pre-call, a fascinating conversation about some of the process and the thinking about crafting a narrative in both the first part and then in the present day, effectively, of most of our experience, not back into the 17th century or any of the other digestions of the kind of the themes, the woven themes of New York as a place and people. In that pre-call, I think Ric referred to the two of you as nerdaholics, right? That have an absolutely endless appetite to learn about the city, to work as hard as possible. And I know for as long as I've known you, which is probably 20 years or more, that you're always polishing a project, sometimes a decade's worth of polishing, but polishing to perfection because you are a perfectionist and you bring so much focus as well as a kind of, grasp, kind of arms reached in order to try to, you mentioned all the books that are on your shelf behind you today, people who have created over the last couple of decades books on some aspect of the history of New York, and each one has taken a slice or a lens through which to observe and to argue. So could you talk a little bit about the process of your both the earlier collaboration and also this time around, how it's different to work in the present, how much time, how many years you spent trying to find the themes, and how you worked with other people in order for them to inform a story that you already had in your mind, an argument about, what New York is.
Sure, I'd be happy to, and I think Ric should chime in at some point because it's hard to explain how closely we work together to find our way through. I mean, the challenge was not only to do with the simple, breathtaking scale of the topic. I mean, it's a city of 400 years of history, 400 square miles, more or less, of extent. A place where, more things have happened, as Ken Jackson says in the opening of the film of the series, than any equivalent place. Manhattan Island alone, as he points out, more has happened probably than any similarly scaled part of the world, or certainly part of the United States. But in my view, that wasn't actually the biggest problem. The biggest problem that Ric and I had to solve was, as Ric alluded to, what was the story? A city is not like a war or like other kinds of event or journey or other kinds of things you could write about, which although they might sprawl, have in some way the form of a beginning, a middle, and an end. What's the beginning, a middle, and end of? Well, maybe there's a beginning of a city when it's founded, but after that, it's a place that goes on. So we had to somehow find our way through and figure out, precisely because we could not do, as Ric said, create an encyclopedia. Who would watch that? So that's just, it was endless conversations. I can remember even on Sunday afternoons being on the phone with Ric and just taking in all the material we had discussed during the week and just, trying to figure out, like, what are we trying to say? And to some degree, it was Ric, who I'm trained as an architect, and I think about place, and that comes very naturally to me. But the turning of a thing into a narrative was something that I came along on. And I remember Ric would say, "What's at stake? Why do we care? There's lots of facts here, lots of information, but like, why am I still watching this show? Why haven't I hit my remote and shut it off?" And I think that was really, really the greatest challenge. And, as we sort of clawed our way episode by episode through it, always trying to find the through line through that episode, relating that episode to the ones that came before and after. It was an incredible learning experience for me. And I would say, in part in answer to the two-part sort of ancillary question you had, first of all, yes, it happened that the moment we were writing in the 1990s, we were sitting on this incredible effusion of historical writing about New York that had occurred just before us. And indeed, that was a pitch, one of the ways we pitched the project to the National Endowment for the Humanities and others, was that we could build on and make accessible to a large public this really rich 1970s, 80s, and 90s historiography about New York, part of which I myself had, been a student of Ken Jackson's and grown up with, and so that was fascinating. Now, it's funny in retrospect because you might have thought, oh, then that was like an effusion and then we'd have a break. But behind me are 3 shelves of books written about New York in the last 20 years, as you point out. It never stopped. There's just this incredible outpouring about every aspect of the city: physical transformation, policy decisions, music, culture, painting, art, neighborhoods. So part of our job, of course, is to try to process all of that information. And the last in this very long answer is to say that something that I think was very important to both of us was to realize that we were, after all, just 2 nerdaholics, or whatever Rick called us, and that it would be very important to have other voices and other points of view. And there we had the enormous advantage of having people that we interviewed for the series who could then be asked to write pieces, contribute pieces, or we would redact their interviews. And it gives me, it's hard, I'm not wrong in saying that maybe one of the things I'm proudest of, or maybe the thing I'm proudest of in the companion volume, is that together in one place is sort of like the world's greatest supergroup of New York history, that you have Ken Jackson and Mike Wallace and Bob Caro and Bob Stern and Marshall Berman and Philip Lopate and David Levering Lewis and Carol Birkin. And now, keeping that tradition up, and I think to the same standards, Esther Fuchs, Suketu Mehta, and Adam Gopnik. And our book is, just to say it's enhanced by those interviews, I mean, and those essays, it gives this incredible richness and and I think just, it's almost like a symphony when you hear their voices and playing against what we had to say. So that's been an enormous pleasure for it. And I'm just, as someone who is in fact a student and who learned so much from the people like Ken Jackson, it just gives me enormous pleasure to be part of something that they're part of. Sometimes I still can't imagine, I still can't believe it, that I'm like, that Ken Jackson is part of my book, or our book, is really exciting. Rick, do you want to open on that?
No, I think that that's a very, very much what our process was. I mean, it's a huge amount of material in New York, but in the end, what you're working with, making a film and then making a book based on a film, is a few elements. You have third-person narration, which you have to write. You have interviews, you have voiceover, and you have archival material of one kind or another. And the story is going to emerge from the interplay of all those pieces. And the sooner you have some version of all those pieces to begin to sort with and contend with, the better off you're going to be. Because again, we rest on the extraordinary work of scholars and writers and encyclopedists, and would be nowhere without them. But what we had actually no model for was what the story was going to be. There isn't a book, which is a narrative book, that says, here's the history of New York from the beginning. And in grappling with that, we, with the aid of our scholars who were with us every step of the way, I mean, we would submit drafts of treatments and of scripts and talk to them as we were going into the NEH for money. And we would interview them and we would work with their interviews, and they would see the concept, the product of that. And what we came up with was a film that begins in 1609 when Henry Hudson rounds the corner of Coney Island and sees this remarkable inland port, potential port, and comes down to initially the year 2000. And we discovered that for us, the story of New York comes to very important episodic conclusions. For example, in 1825, where our first episode ends, when the Erie Canal opened, and thereby kind of like exponentially increased the power of the port city and the waterway, New York already existed within. But the Erie Canal, this kind of man-made river, was a tremendous life-changing moment in New York's history. The Civil War, 1865, during which issues of order and disorder came to the fore in the city's history, really in a kind of like a galvanic way, culminating in the draft rights, in a sense that cities had to do a different kind of job, dealing with all the people who had were attracted into it as a result of the Erie Canal and the tremendous flourishing of commerce and manufacturing and the Industrial Revolution. And then after the Civil War, down through 1898, the Great Consolidation, this massive period in which most of the institutions that we think of as New York grew. And then after that, another incredible episode culminating at the end of the First World War, when, the population of New York trebled in 2 decades. This astonishing influx of people coming in through that harbor, through Ellis Island, built in the 1890s, and then radically changing the demography and the culture and the politics and the society of New York, such that by the time the First World War was over, New York was a changed place. Again, transformation after transformation. And then this remarkable, and here hats off to you, Carol, in all sorts of ways, this kind of emerging upward direction, which had been going on since the latter part of the 19th century, spectacularly exploded as the skyline was transformed in the post-World War I era. And we had this, the roaring 20s, as it's glibly called, this period during which, so much culturally, socially, architecturally, the look of the skyline emerged from downtown with the Bank of the Manhattan Company, uptown to the Chrysler Building, and then spectacularly at the time of the crash, because you can't keep roaring indefinitely. All the parties were going to come to an end eventually. And the Empire State Building, as Carol Willis knows better than anyone, all the tallest buildings are always built at the end of booms. And the Empire State Building, like the World Trade Center in a later generation, was built. So we had another sort of narrative stopping point in 1831, where as the city and the country and the world descends into depression, up comes this remarkable building, forever unsurrounded. Nobody built more buildings around it because it was the end of the boom. That's why we can see it from 40 miles away. And then at the post-depression, this transformative period, suddenly billions of dollars in real money are being flooded into Fiorello LaGuardia by his pal FDR in the 1930s and early 40s. And the city is transformed once again. Bridges, tunnels, parks, parkways. This massive transformation of the city. And then what we thought was the final episode of our film, 1945 to the present, in which New York emerges on top of the world, the preeminent unofficial capital of the world in 1945. And 2 years later, it's fighting for its life. People are flooding out of it. All the problems of the 1960s and the 1970s are born in this kind of anti-urban, kind of catastrophic chapter in the city's history. And the city came back from that. So again and again, you have this sort of, this kind of sort of almost convulsive degrees of transformation, which I think define these major chapters of the city's history and became the stories that we told within each of these episodes and then subsequent chapters. And that has continued in a way that no one would have predicted. As the city recovered from 9/11, no one thought the city was going to recover from 9/11. It was one of those, it's dead now for sure this time moments. And it did recover. And no one could have predicted that there would be not one, not two, but 3 more massive crises that the city would confront during the first 2 decades alone of the 21st century. So challenge and transformation has continued to be the core story of the city, and why people look to it. It's not that New York's different. It's just there's more. It's more intense. What happens in most places happens here either sooner or in a way that's more, sort of central. It becomes the epicenter of forces and trends and challenges of the world, and therefore it becomes the kind of thing that people. It is in a sense literally the canary in the world mine shaft. that people look to again and again to see how's it doing, because sooner or later we are going to be grappling with all those things that New York City is grappling with. And, you know, again, no time like the present.
Well, earlier today in the pre-call, you made 2 points that similar to what you've just said. One is that the story of New York is a national story, that everyone looks to New York, or New York leads in many ways. Of course, we see increasingly in the present moment that New York is very much its own place, separate from some of the larger trends of American politics and society. But the second thing that we talked about earlier were the 4 kind of determinative or historical markers within the last 20 years. And maybe, James, you could talk about how those determine the structure of the last 2 chapters, or the penultimate chapter of the book, and then the future of cities, which takes it beyond that. How now, as you mentioned those, some of them are quite specific to New York, like Superstorm Sandy. So could you talk about this tension between New York as a national story in the last 20 years of New York having its own particular challenges, certainly most dramatically 9/11 and the destruction of the World Trade Center?
Sure. Well, I maybe I would take a little exception to the idea of Superstorm Sandy being a New York story. It is quintessential example of everything that we do in our series, which is that, I mean, Central Park is in New York and it's right in the heart of New York, but it's not just another park in the heart of New York, or the Brooklyn Bridge, not just another bridge. They stand for all other things like them. They are the park, the bridge. Similar, I would say, about Superstorm Sandy, just to pick that as where you were headed. You know, it's hardly only New York that is going to be threatened by rising sea levels. Almost every major city in the world is on a coastline, and a good probably 2/3 of them are on ocean coastlines. And I've read a statistic, I think it's something like some astonishing number of people, 75% of the United States lives within 50 miles of one of the ocean shores, which is kind of, or something like that. It's an astonishing number. So it seems to me that's the perfect example of the kind of story that we're talking about, which has incredible specificity to New York as it unfolded, with almost kind of a dramatic, you know, almost like a disaster movie. Well, I guess it was a kind of a disaster movie, but the implications of which go around the United States, around the world, will define our future. And it happens that New York, for a series of historical reasons, was unusually open to, or, you know, what would be the word, threatened by this kind of situation, in part because it opens directly to the ocean, which was, of course, one of the great sources of its commercial rise. And secondly, that it has so much landfill. One of the more startling statistics in the newer chapters is that something like 25% of modern New York City is on landfill. And so that land is low. It's like Holland, and thus it is incredibly, you know, can be incredibly easily flooded. But I'd say generally, every one of the stories we're talking about shares that quality of being incredibly powerful as a local story, but then never, the meaning of the story never stops at the borders of New York City. Certainly 9/11 is obviously, it was the World Trade Center that was attacked. It was not a building in Cincinnati, and it was not somewhere else, and it probably wouldn't have been. It was obvious why you would pick the World Trade Center if you were going to make that kind of attack, as hideous a notion as that is. But certainly you would hardly call it a local story. It was, you know, defining of the 21st century. The financial crisis of 2008, 2009 destroyed the economy of the world in the space of 10 days. Down on Wall Street, I mean, not literally on Wall Street, but in Midtown and Wall Street, the 7 or 8 banks that run a giant chunk of the world economy suddenly fell, as Andrew Ross Sorkin says in one of our interviews, like dominoes, as they watched it unfold. And, you know, millions, tens of millions of people would lose their jobs, and tens of millions of people would lose their homes. And Sandy was the same. And of course, pandemic was the strangest of all, that it was it had broken out in Italy, of course. It's kind of the first place people took notice. It started in China, goes to Italy, but it becomes this kind of, it gets the world's attention in a way that it hadn't before when it explodes in New York City, for reasons that have to do with New York's connectedness to the rest of the world. And then becomes the topic of an entire long-term conversation about density and concentration and the evils of density and concentration, a conversation that's been going on in the United States since Thomas Jefferson and before. And so it's exactly, those are the notions of it. And I would just, to finish this off, I mean, structurally, and again, this is something I learned from Ric, you know, we are making a television show and there is a quality of if it bleeds, it leads. So those intense, disastrous situations inevitably rise up as climactic moments in a show, and then you basically are building the fabric of the city in between. And that's, I would say, a little bit, describes a little bit of how the episodes generally play out, but particularly the last two chapters and episodes.
I take real exception to something you said there, James. First of all, that it's a television show. And second of all, that if it bleeds, it leads. Because I think that I understand what you're saying and why you say that. So I'm going to chastise you with love and affection for saying that. We're making a film. We shot on film through most, not video. We shot on film through most of the New York series and then changed in mid-core because finally video acquired the same could acquire the same luminosity that film could have. And it's not if it bleeds, it leads. It's that film is, so is any visual medium that unfolds over time, is quintessentially narrative. First one thing happens and then another thing happens. And however postmodern or complex or however much film resists its narrativity, it's going to be a narrative. And so it's not if it bleeds, it leads. It is what is important. What is the story? What draws people in? Why do they care about it? And I would say that, for example, in the first episode of our film, which went from 1609 to 1825, you know, it ended with the building of it ended with DeWitt Clinton creating the grid when most of Manhattan was still sort of huddled down at lower Manhattan, most of New York City. He sort of commissioned this plan, which foresaw the future going all the way up to the end of the islands. It's astonishing kind of vision of growth, which is the grid we inherited. And then kind of not content with mapping it out, he made sure that this 363-mile ditch from Buffalo to Albany would be dug so that everything bought, mined, timbered, manufactured in what we call the heartland of the continent would come by the Bowery. Come by the Battery. That was not something that was bleeding. That was something that was kind of coming together in an extraordinary way as a kind of like a second nature. A new kind of river was created that transformed the city's history. So I think it's that we're making film narratives in the course of which indeed people bleed. 144 women, fall burning from the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, in 1911. The draft riots. But it's not because those are not in there because people are bleeding. And the films do not have any quality of leading, however much they may or may not, because of that. It is because they're trying to find out what phase of development this place, New York, which has always been, as James said, both a local place and a global place, a place where Lenape Native Americans lived, but a place that caught the eye of the Dutch West India Company back in the Netherlands. So its beginning as a European enterprise was meant that it was this tension between the local and the global was there from the very start. And so we have been intent, James and I and our colleagues, on finding that river that runs through each of the sub-episodes and comes out sometimes the moments of great suffering, the draft riots, which ends our second episode, and sometimes moments of sort of very complex ambiguity, a depression and this remarkable monument to what people rapidly came to feel of the Empire State Building. This is everything New York stands for. Couldn't rent a square foot in it, for years after that. when it opened in 1931, having been built in 13 months. Astonishing story, given the way we build today, and the geologic pace of most kind of enterprises of that kind. But that's really trying to find the points where the city kind of comes to points of great culmination and then transition. And what's happened is again and again, New York has shown that it comes to these moments of really great epochal culmination and then transition. And when, quote, the new episode begins, and our episodes are merely tracking New York's biography. When the new episode of the city's biography begins, you know, it's the same: commerce, diversity, sort of a transformational quality, an aspirational quality, and yet something is new. Now you have federal monies and the Depression. You know, now you have America itself sitting on top of the world in the post-World War II period, and New York's position within that. So it's again and again that attempt to, whether it's writing chapters for a book or, you know, taking the research and writing the scripts themselves, which usually come first, but not this time, finding that through line that moves you towards that culminating moment of transition within one underlying story that has been our shibboleth. It's like something written on a Bazooka Joe comic. It's so banal and cliche, but it's been our guiding light from the very beginning, which is that a story was founded when New Amsterdam was founded. And that story was a kind of experiment to see whether all the peoples of the world could live together in a single place. That is as powerful, you know, on March 8th, 2022, as it was in the 1620s or the 1720s or the 18 or the 1920s. And that turns out to be, you know, all the peoples of the world, global, in a single place, local, turns out to be the kind of guiding DNA that has so far, you know, not failed us yet. I hope it hasn't.
Well,
And properly chastised.
Yeah, exactly.
Rick has said this enough times in our conversations that I completely believe his commitment to this idea of narrative. So let me just be more mundane and focus on process, and have James answer how visualizing these last 20 years was the challenge of expanding the story into neighborhoods that may not have been discussed so much in the earlier history, when larger tranches of time and a more kind of consensus history about the periodization of pre-war, post-war, you know, et cetera, but dealing with only 20 years and finding a way to visualize that story where you're not necessarily working from archival material anymore, but you're having to perhaps commission or gather and, you know, investigate new relationships for visualization.
That's a great question. Yeah, there and so many ways to unfold that. Yeah, I mean, obviously, as we've discussed, one of the issues of the last doing these two new chapters and episodes are that, you know, there's sort of an, you know, established understandings of earlier periods of the city's history, which are shared certainly at a high scholarly level, but at some level everybody kind of knows the difference between the 1960s in New York and the Depression in New York. That's, you know, that's not too subtle. And so what is that for the last 20 years? We're still in it. So we've been, you know, having to, in a way, do something we didn't really have to do as much before, or do it in maybe a different way, which is, you know, determine what are the themes, what's the mood, the tone, and so forth. Keeping it, obviously, we're very aware of the fact that it has to be a unity with everything that's come before. It has to draw through the themes that comes before. Indeed, one thing you can argue, absolutely, is that every major theme we talked about in the first 8 episodes sprang back to life, or re-energized in ways. You want immigration, you think you had immigration Irish and German days, and then the, you know, Jews and the Italian days. Well, look what's going on here. Those look, you know, as massive as they were. Now it is the entire world that is implicated in this process. You wanted globalization, and now you have things like the financial crisis, where what happens in banks on Wall Street, or Superstorm Sandy, to pick that example again. So every one of those themes seems to have come back to life with incredible energy over the last 20 years. There was, we did have the benefit, obviously, of all these wonderful sources of people who have been writing about things in the last 20 years, and kind of those wonderful 3 contributions that have been made. One difference did emerge in the, I would say, in the images, because when we were working on the original, certainly the original 7 chapters, most of the images were archival in nature. In other words, they were images of things that had come before. And now we had an interesting opportunity to do a kind of a visual portrait of the city that has just happened or is still happening. And so we did jump on that opportunity by going out of our way to find the best and most interesting contemporary photographers who were working, and to include that, reach out to them, and in many cases literally contact them directly. And we got this incredible rush of excitement of people feeling like they would be included, and we were excited. And so I'd say the new 2 chapters are kind of a feast of a kind of a portrait of contemporary New York that has a little bit of a different feel than inevitably than the earlier chapters, but it's something I think we're very proud of. And here is a good moment to take a moment to say an incredible thank you to our publishers, Alfred Knopf and everybody we worked with there, because one thing we knew, which was that if we went out and we found the best photography happening in New York over the last 20 years, it would look incredibly good in the book that we were doing, because they talk about, never stinting. They just will go the extra mile for you and making sure they're making the most beautiful possible book. So a shout out to them. But yeah, that was some of the issues and challenges and opportunities of doing the new material.
I mean, I would
Rick,
say, as a footnote to that, I mean, what happened is Mike Wallace, the historian who has helped so many people understand New York, and continues to do so, and helped us immeasurably, said after 9/11 that the events of 9/11 were revelatory. They literally revealed things which had not been seen so clearly before. Starting with, they revealed what the inside of a skyscraper looked like once it had been gashed by an airplane. So just in very basic and even grim and horrific ways. But that also had revealed the degree to which New York was in one of the cities in the midst of an entirely global archipelago of cities. And that globalization was afoot, and had been for some time. And I think that what that meant, and this affected what James has pointed to in terms of the photographs collected for the book, but every aspect of these of the work that we've done for the last, covering the last 2 decades of the city's history, which is that it's really kind of a history of the present. And that goes back to, in many ways, the events of 9/11, which we treated in the end of our 8th episode, that we're now talking about things which, sure, 9/11 happened here, but surprise, surprise, political terror happens around the world, as do all the great catastrophes of the last 20 years. They're both local and absolutely planetary. And so in some sense, what we're now grappling with, and it has affected the kind of granularity of the film visually, in terms of having this amazing cadre of photographers who have been out in the streets of the city for the last 20 years and created this remarkable record, which doesn't look like the past. It looks like this is the city we live in. And it has this kind of haunting nearness to the contemporary moment as it's unfolding. And I think that what's happened is our film now is really, our series now is engaged with something which is still narrative, inevitably, and it must be narrative, but it is now so tautly intertwined with forces and events and personalities and forces that are shaping what's happening right now. And I think there's a kind of, I know James feels this tremendously. I know I do too. It's a tremendous urgency. I mean, it feels like New York has never been a nostalgic place, but it feels less nostalgic than ever. Like what happens here matters. And with the decisions that are made and how we respond to crises and how we're going to grapple with these massive forces, which are irreversible. There's no, the opposite of New York is isolationism. And that's a trend politically America, not exclusively, has been dealing with for a very long time. We're now dealing in the third decade of the 21st century with this tremendous, again, global conflict, which has to do with, will we grasp our inevitable interconnectedness, or will we resist and try to retreat into silos, ethnicities, races, and try to somehow avoid the unavoidable? And I think that's where we are as we kind of enter this third decade of the 21st century.
I just want to jump in on something that struck me in what Ric just said. And it comes out of something he said. We were doing an interview. I think it was, we were interviewing Vishaan Chakrabarty, and we were talking about Penn Station. And Vishaan was talking, who spent much of his career thinking about Penn Station and working on it, and was talking about what kind of a challenge it was, how in some ways the nostalgia for the old McKinley and White scheme has gotten in the way of other things. And Ric turned to me afterward and he goes, these guys have no nostalgia for old New York. It's a whole new ballgame. This is not this kind of, oh, the good old days, the Dodgers and, Penn Station and all that. This is like, this is the city we have. What are we going to do with it? And for them, Penn Station is not looking at a picture book of old pictures of McKinley and White. It's, what are we going to do with this place? Which is really a standing problem. And, we can be informed by the grandeur of what went before us, but our focus has to be to the future. And that's where, it was Ric's thought to call the episodes The Future of Cities, because it seemed
and
us
as you
that
started out by saying, Carol, we're no longer, Manhattan is the oldest and least interesting part of the city. The New York, you can't, the phrase outer borough doesn't really exist except as a quaint, malapropism. New York is now more than a 5-borough city, and it's what's happening in the most, enterprising and new and transformational ways is happening in Brooklyn, happening in Queens, happening in the Bronx, happening in Staten Island, and New York, Manhattan benefits from that. But I would say we've left behind this idea of a city sort of like sternly located, at say 34th and 5th Avenue, where the Empire State Building pokes its head up to this day. But we're now, among the things Mike Wallace pointed out, revealed. The people who died in the World Trade Center came from a radius of 100 miles, 150 miles away. That's what the city is. And we have become only more so. And I think that great ability to write, call it creative destruction, Joseph Schumpeter, we've moved on and we think about the past and we care about the past, but we are powerfully as New Yorkers, and I think as all people should, tremendously concerned with, how we are grappling with the challenges, partly that we've created and partly that are coming at us.
Well, those sound rather like summary thoughts, but before we end for the evening, because we do have a few minutes left, and I can invite people to offer questions in the chat. I'm not sure that we'll get to them, and some of them may be too specific. I did want to ask you both, but maybe James, you could start with characterizing the upcoming 2 hours, right, of public broadcasting documentary film that will be the coda to the series, and unusually enough, the reverse, the follow-up to the book, rather than the book as a companion piece. Well, it still is a companion piece, but yeah. Tell us more about the upcoming video.
Well, I'll let Ric tell you more about the films. He is the director of the films. I'll just say one thing, which is the experience of sitting in on the interviews that we've been doing now for the past many years. And I mentioned the one with Vishaan, but really it's been the most incredible experience. just the most recent round of interviews we did, just the ones that are freshest in our mind, we interviewed a doctor called Eric Blutinger, for example, who was a frontline doctor at Mount Sinai Elmhurst during the COVID epidemic. He was in the talk about the center of the center of the center. And we asked him to draw a kind of word picture for us because we couldn't be there. No one could be there unless you had to be there, or unless, unfortunately, had to be there for the worst reasons. And in just chilling, but also, I don't know, it's hard to explain how intense his description of what it was like to be, day after day after day, bringing everything he knew as a doctor, as an emergency room doctor, to this incredible effort and just staying in it. So that just right there, someone like Andrew Ross Sorkin describing, watching the financial crisis unfold day by day, another 7 days, and just saying, wait a minute, just having absorbed the information about Lehman and sort of finally getting that Lehman, founded in the 1850s, before the Civil War, was now going to go out of business, and having gotten that into their heads, going, wait a minute, but haven't you heard about Merrill Lynch? And saying, Merrill Lynch, what are you talking about? And realizing that it was just going to go on and on and on. And I'll just finish by saying Adam Gopnik, who we did a long, incredible interview, who actually was tearing up by the end of the interview, as we all were, by his incredible, again, trying to just process what has happened to his city and how he's dealt with us and kind of walking us through it. And that, I can just tell you, there's just incredible experience. Happily, we're making a film out of it, but we could have just done it and it would have been an incredible experience for us and the crew. But with that, I'll let Rick talk a little bit more about the shape of the films themselves.
But that's those interviews, and again, the interviews, their tone, the reflectiveness of the interviewees, as whoever they are, process what they know and what they've experienced, and more, this is not just what they know, but what they've experienced. So all of the quote scholars and interviewees about New York are people who are also New Yorkers who have been here through these crises. And that's been something that's very special, Carol. I think that these are people who are, they're eyewitnesses as well as nerdaholics, and have enormous skin in the game. And that's why I think, in the course of these two very, very difficult years, people are, their nerves are right at the surface. And Adam, with no embarrassment, wept many times during the interview, as we all did, thinking about New York, thinking about its challenges, thinking about its many, many faults and flaws and issues that it has created for itself and that it grapples with. And so these two new 2-hour films that we have underway, which we think of both collectively under the rubric, The Future of Cities. It's in fact the title of the last film, which goes from 2013 down through into this year, are attempts to, raw as we are, as everyone, not just New Yorkers, everyone, grapple with where we find ourselves as human beings, on the edge of the future. And that's, it's made me feel, James and I felt this again and again, like each episode, it felt like, well, that's kind of, how are you going to follow up the incredible narrative climax, which was the draft riots, to this day, the worst instance of civil unrest in American history, in a kind of a per capita basis, 119 people at the very least dead, in a few hot days in July of 1863, but each episode took this very basic, absolutely crucial story. How are all the peoples of the world going to live together in a single place? And carried it further with, even more people over an even larger scale, grappling even more intensely, culturally, socially, politically, artistically, technologically, with how you create a world. How do we build bridges? How do we create culture? How do we make museums? How do we stop from fighting each other? How do we combat racism? How do we both have law enforcement, but also have an understanding of the systemic aspects of racism, which have been part of the American world from the very start? And that time and again, each phase of the city's history comes to, what has felt like an even greater climax. The worst thing that ever happened to New York, it seemed, was the tremendous post-World War II downturn, during which the city almost died. Ford City dropped dead. Daily News headline, notorious from October of 1975. And it did come back. And then the buildings came back. So you have this tremendous cycle of, wow, as God bless him, Pete Hamill said. Pete was in a board meeting for the Museum of the City of New York in the Tweed Courthouse on the morning of September 11th, 2001. And he came out of the building when it was clear that something was going on. Saw the second plane go in, and Pete said, he looked at it and he said, "Oh God, there's something new in the world." And that sense that, the tsunami of the future is coming. And it tends to hit very, very powerfully in this place called New York. And we look to it to see what's going to happen. So, we've been, I feel like more than ever, we're kind of trying to find our way through, this tremendous sort of congeries of issues and forces which are confronting the city and the world right now.
Well, that would seem to be a summary sentence, but James, let me offer you a chance to express your romance with the city. We talked earlier how we're all hopeless romantics about New York, our
one way or the other,
first loves. So, thinking of this 20 and 30 years worth of enterprise on the city, what have you learned? What do you do different in this last section?
Well, I don't think it's so much of what's different, but I do think that we're not unafraid to leave to try to have pat answers for things. I mean, there are fundamental problems that or tensions that occur in the city and the one that is on everyone's mind, of course, is the simple sheer cost of living in New York and the cost of housing in New York in particular, which now has, there was of course this moment of respite, which we guessed would not last. And indeed we wrote would not last. And indeed yesterday's New York Times said it didn't last. It's rents and prices are right back to where they were and with no sign of stopping in New York. So, many cities would love to have that problem. There are many older cities, older industrial cities, which in some sense are versions of New York, all across the Midwest of the United States and many other parts of the United States that would love to have the problem that too many people want to live there. What are you going to do? I mean, you can build housing, and we fully support building housing. I've worked on a book on housing for a long time. We totally support the idea of the building of housing, but we're fully aware that it's a bigger problem than that. And that's something we talk about, that it haunted both the Bloomberg and the de Blasio administrations, that you couldn't really build your way out of the problem. And so that's just one example. Is the issue that Ric brought up of the intrinsic tension between the desire for a safe and secure city, which everyone wants, and sort of, you might argue, disadvantaged people need more than anyone, because they can't they don't have all the resources of isolation, apartment lobby doormen and things like that, being able to take cars. They have to be in the city. And the tension between the need for that and then concerns about over-policing, aggressive policing, systemic racism as manifested in policing, issues that were brought to such an incredible moment with Black Lives Matter. Again, there's no easy answer, and I think we all know there's no easy answer. And so we've been willing, I think, to acknowledge that, of course, we couldn't do this project if we weren't in love with New York and in love with its meaning, its aspiration, its importance to people. What I think always impresses both Ric and me is just how broad and wide that feeling of aspiration and romance is, that it really is. And this is another way of saying this is a national or international thing. It is, to use the cliche phrase a little bit that was used during the Olympics, the idea of the second home, the world's second home. It's cliche, but it's true. It does feel like the world's second home. And as Timothy Garton-Ash said in our section on the Trade Center, one of the reasons that 9/11 hit home was people felt it was their city being attacked. And in some sense, it was their city being attacked. And we, are second to none in our feelings of that. But having said that, I think we're also, willing to not just say, but in a funny way, explore and revel in isn't the right word, but certainly go deep into the fact that New York, one of the things that it brings to a kind of a higher pitch are fundamental tensions and challenges and conflicts within society, the relationship of people with other people, different kinds of people with other people, and the relationship of people with nature, which is now, one wouldn't have thought of it so much, but now in the 21st century has obviously come to the fore.
Well, now we really are over our time, but I can see very clearly from all of this discussion we had tonight that the two of you characterize at least two of the characteristics of most New Yorkers, and that you're smart and you work really hard. So these years, these books, these films are an immense accomplishment to try to grapple with the multitude of New York, with the multitude of ideas, with the richness of the history. And really, it's hard to think of two people who have done as heroic and Herculean a job in tackling these themes. And it's because you're smart and you work hard and you're New Yorkers. So we thank you for that. We look
Carol, that's
forward to
incredibly
the
gracious of you.
films. We hope everybody's going to buy a book so that they have it on their coffee table and that they can point it out to all of their friends when they come over. That we'll all have a toast to New York and to James Sanders and Ric Burns tonight. Thank you so much for being with us. Everybody, please join us in April for the next book talk, which is about Holly White, Richard Rain, a journalist who has just done what the Times called a marvelous biography of William H. White and his wisdom, called The American Urbanist. But this book talk series will be interrupted by a 5-part series on construction history, where we are going to look in great detail at from the bottom up, from foundations, frames, facades, and fire at the last quarter of the 19th century to the 1920s in building construction history with Don Friedman and Tom Leslie and a host of others. So there's more history to come, and it's all about New York, but also about Chicago for construction history. So thanks everybody for being with us tonight. You'll be able to watch this again and tell your friends about it, finding it on our YouTube channel and eventually on our website, so that this will become part of the archive of New York history. So thanks again, James and Ric. See you next time, everybody. Bye.
Thank you, Carol, so much.
Thank you.